Time. I promise I won't say it again. If you're just joining now, please make sure your camera and microphone are off. This webinar does get reposted on our YouTube channel when it's over. So if you'd rather not have your likeness up in the corner of that video, please make sure your camera's off. All right, so we're going to get started here. So this is a short webinar about the transition to the new 2022 Louisiana Student Standards for Social Studies. This has actually been part of a series of webinars we've been doing and will continue doing for about the next month or so. If you see on the Social Studies landing page on Louisiana Believes under that implementation box, you could there's a link to a PDF of all the webinars. The previous links to the Zoom sessions become links to the recordings. So if you miss one, you can go there, click on those and watch the YouTube videos. And we have the next one is on December 8th, and we're going to talk about high school U.S. history and civics. But this session is particularly and specifically about 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So I'm going to introduce our small coterie of people from the department that are here today. I'm Sean Diamond. I'm a Louisiana Social Studies lead, and I'm joined by Samantha Chesson and Chandra Phillips, who are waving. They're both social studies specialists who work at the department, help us get all this good work done here. So we have a few different objectives for today. It's a very short session, but hopefully at the end you're going to be able to walk out doing these three things. So the first being describe kind of some updates on the timeline and what supports the department will have available for 6th through 8th grade social studies teachers, prior to and right when these new standards are implemented in the next school year. We'll spend most of the time talking about the major shifts as we see them in regards to the skills and content for these grade levels. And I'm going to be emphasizing where and how Louisiana state history fits in here, because we've heard that concern. And then finally, we'll talk about some ways we think that could begin to have teachers prepare for this transition to the new standards in a way that's not onerous and asking too much of people that are currently teaching 2011 standards, still have a state assessment on those standards coming up, et cetera, et cetera. All right, and our agenda, maps onto those objectives hopefully pretty well. So let's jump right in. First, let me get my video off. Okay. So first update, we are now reviewing new social studies instructional materials, curriculum. This process had been paused since I believe 2017, but we have begun again. And we partnered with a national organization, Ed Reports, to make a rubric for social studies curriculum that we are very proud of. The link is on this page of the deck here, which is available in the folder that my colleagues have probably already shared. But I would just please go take a look at what we crafted here. Hopefully it's pretty straightforward along, like these are the kind of elements, various indicators that we think any really high quality or tier 1 social studies curriculum would have. We have gotten recently some submissions. We expect some more actually pretty quickly. You can follow the updates that are put out by the IMR team if you want to learn more about that. But that process is just getting started. So go check that out. Next, we are continuing to work on the course frameworks, which were meant to be replacements for the scope and sequence documents. We previewed these at the Teacher Leader Summit over the summer. And in here, I just want to just start with being totally transparent, kind of mea culpa. At that summit, I had promised these by December, but due to some factors that were quite frankly out of our hands, that date has kind of changed a bit now. So we are now shooting for a late March, early April delivery of all these, but we will post them as they are completed. We've contracted with a whole bunch of teachers around the state through our Teacher Leader Advisor program, and they are literally just beginning to work on these now. So again, we do plan on completing these still. Just the timeline has shifted to from December to late March, early April. And just to really quickly go over again what these are and what they are not, So what they are is we took the standards and we organized them into units, topics, listed out the relevant standards and offered some suggested pacing that fit into these different 3 different windows throughout the year. You can kind of see the darker lines here indicating the windows. For each of these topics, we have a big framing question to kind of encapsulate all the learning in that topic. Students might answer that in a kind of extended response or do a Socratic seminar around it. But then we have smaller, more concrete supporting questions that hopefully build up to that framing question. And for each supporting question, we're offering a variety of primary and secondary sources of many different types, and then kind of the most important key terminology that relates to that question and topic. Okay, so no scripted plans vis-a-vis the old scope and sequence documents, at least in this first iteration here. So once more, apologies. Look for these in March, not December. All right, and then lastly, same thing, we are continuing to work on a bank of instructional strategies related to social studies classrooms, very much in line with what ELA currently has. These are going to be, kind of headline, like what is this strategy, how to implement it in classrooms, some examples from different grade bands. We know these entries are going to cover things like contextualization, how you annotate in social studies, different ways to have, run deliberations and debates in classroom. Those are not exactly the same thing. For K2 teachers, we're going to have some guidance on how read alouds can work. Real quick here, here's an example, very short example. This is kind of a protocol or organizer that we lifted from the excellent Gates Ventures Curriculum World History Project for high school world history. So what students do here is, they record the claim or the question they're trying to answer, what events, processes, people, ideas are involved in that. And then they place that event on a timeline and try and think of events that, precede and follow it to kind of develop their internal chronology. And then they, put that on a map, right? Whether that's a very localized map of, say like Louisiana or the nation or the world, but they place that event on a map to make that connection in geography. So this is the type of thing we're talking about there. And I'm actually going to give another example about kind of a protocol around cause and effect later in the presentation. Okay, so those are the big updates from us. Just to recap, we are reviewing materials now. We've actually started that. Hope to get more submissions shortly. We are still working on the course frameworks, but the timeline for delivery has slightly been pushed back. And same thing goes with our instructional strategy bank. Now to shift gears here, we're going to talk about not all of, because that would literally take a few days, but the biggest, most salient changes for each grade level as it relates to both the kind of skills and practices we're expecting students to develop and the content, the specific historical, civic, economic, geographic content that they're learning in that grade level. Before I get real specific though, I do want to kind of frame the purpose of these changes again, because I think without this, they can seem kind of arbitrary and maybe unfair. So if you visit classrooms around Louisiana and honestly the nation, English classrooms especially, you're going to see statements like this posted up on the walls and said by the teachers, right? So good readers ask questions, good readers create pictures in their mind, good readers make connections when they read. Okay, so this is all great, right? These are teachers modeling what good readers do. It's not enough, right? It's not enough to teach students what good readers do. We got to teach them what good readers know. And our ability to make meaning of text is not a skill you can directly practice in the way you can directly practice decoding, right? Learning how to read in that sense. Reading comprehension is really more of a reflection of the amount of knowledge and vocabulary that you have. And this is kind of a paradox, right? Because it means that to acquire knowledge and vocabulary, you need a certain amount of knowledge and vocabulary. And that's where this new sequence that the standards create come from. The idea being we want to build knowledge in a kind of purposeful, cohesive, and ultimately largely a chronological fashion. so we can be purposeful about this. That's why these changes that we have in 6th through 8th grade have materialized the way that they did. And so I just wanted to step back there. If we look at the date range changes for each grade, this is like a super brief Cliff Notes version of it here. But essentially grade 5 is now 1580 through 1791. You can think about it, and that 1580 date came very specifically to put Roanoke in grade 6 and not grade 5. Students in grade 5 will learn about broadly about European exploration, conquest, and colonization of the New World, particularly Spanish history, Spanish and Portugal. Grade 6 will focus on English and French colonization efforts. Grade 7, 1791 to 1877, so like the Whiskey Rebellion through the Compromise 1877, you could include like the very immediate effects of that compromise, and maybe some slight backtracking before the Whiskey Rebellion, because we're covering the first topic is going to be Washington's presidency, so his election to that office. But really, I think this is a fair way to visualize it. And then finally, and most complicated, grade 8, 1877 through the election of 2008. So not the start date and topic is not dissimilar actually from the old US history course in a way. We're beginning with kind of post-Civil War westward expansion and then running up through the 2000 election. I will have more to say about that last topic and how that's going to be handled when we get to grade 8 specifically here. Okay, the other elephant in the room is transitional content. So I had mentioned this at the Teacher Leader Summit. We are aware that when the standards go into effect, particularly that first year of implementation, there's going to be some large gaps in the content students have learned. Some of this we think we can kind of ameliorate by adding on some additional topics for that first year. Some of it just, unfortunately, there's not so much we think we could successfully do or successfully add, right? So I'm going to talk through each of the grades and what we're thinking here. So for grade 6, students that are rising from grade 5 to grade 6, they're actually going to be repeating a good amount of content, right? European exploration, English colonization, Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, that's all going to be repeated. The way we see it looking in grade 6 is actually a good deal deeper than the students had gone in grade 5, but it is repeated content. So that seems like less of a problem. The students might actually be set up really well for grade 6. For grade, actually, I'm going to jump around here because we'll save the most difficult for last. For grade 8, we think this one should also be less jarring for students because the way grade 7 ends, essentially with the 1877 compromise, that's where our new grade 8 course studies starts. It's just not, Louisiana specific anymore. We'll cover the broad US history. So grade 8 also set up okay. It's the grade 7 students rising from grade 6 to grade 7 that are really going to potentially have a kind of a problem here, because we'd be dropping them into the first topic would be Washington's, presidency and the precedent set by that presidency. They're coming from, world civilizations course, right? So we are adding an additional topic that will take a few extra weeks at the beginning of the course, where students will cover, albeit in an imperfect way, the Declaration and the Constitutional Convention, because they are going to really actually need that knowledge to be successful with the grade 7 content, right? It is a shame that some of that world history content that that students rising into grade 6 might miss, but it's not as critical to their understanding of some of these other topics here as the Declaration and Constitution would be to the rest of grade 7. Okay. So to make a long story short here, we are adding additional material for grade 7 into that framework for this first year of implementation. The other grades, it doesn't really make sense. And just to repeat too, to hopefully ease some concerns about this initial year, there will be a new state assessment, but it will be field tested, right? We're testing the test's efficacy and effectiveness, not the students' performance or the teachers' performance here. So hopefully that somewhat eases some concerns. And then, after that, the awkwardness with the transition should kind of smooth out in the second year of implementation. Okay, so I said we were going to talk about the big changes in both content and skills for these grade levels, but just to make sure I'm not mismessaging here, I want to reiterate that in practice, right, in the classroom, these things always go together, the way it's taught and the way it really is learned. You can't really have a piece of content without some associated skill attached to it, right? A subject always needs a predicate. You cannot look at a map of nowhere, Moore's utopia notwithstanding here, right? You can't look at the cause of a non-event. There's always some content matched to the standard. It's just, some content matched to the skill. It's just that the standards kind of pulled them apart. But instructionally, they're always going to go together. Okay, so we're actually going to talk about the biggest changes in skills for all three grades at the same time, because if you haven't noticed, these skills were written by the committees in grade bands, so they read the same. Just headline change here. The biggest shift is kind of our expectations around how students engage with both mostly primary, but also secondary sources, and then the kinds and quality of the claims we expect them to make. Right, so not just they can pull claims and counterclaims out of sources, but they can make their own supported with evidence. It might not look like much, but the really big change in the second block of standards down here, C, in prior grades, this was explain cause and effect, but beginning in sixth grade and then thereafter, it is analyze. That is actually a pretty big change in our expectations. So I believe someone has their microphone on. Just make sure you're muted, your camera's off, please. And this idea of causation being a big thing we want students to think about, I think is also present in these skills and practices. Right? If you're analyzing the connections between ideas, events, and developments, what you're really going to be thinking about is how they affect or potentially cause each other, or how they're related in that kind of causal chain. And so these, like if you can see here, these read the same for each grade. It's just the timeline they're being applied to changes here. And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the changing dates for each courses. So since we're stressing the importance of having students think so much about cause and effect, I want to run through a kind of brief exercise, kind of thought experiment as an example of how this kind of complexity or how thinking about cause and effect could be introduced to middle school students. Please humor me for a few minutes. This is a little bit quirky here. All right, so again, this is just as a way to introduce why it can be so complicated to think about cause and effect. Okay, so I'm going to tell a little quick story here. I promise, 3 slides. So once upon a time, there was a camel named Boudreaux, and for various reasons relating to an unfortunate accident during his birth, he had severe back problems. And this is not the end of Boudreaux's misfortune. He had an exploitative owner, Frank. See, Frank hated camels ever since he had a nasty experience with one in his childhood where it kicked him. So he was very bitter and hadn't trusted camels ever since. See, Frank regularly overloaded his camels prior to taking them on grueling round trips up and down these mountain paths on ways to deliver his goods to his customers. These customers, shockingly, were completely indifferent to these frequent and gross violations of the rights of camels, and even found Frank and his antics vaguely endearing. On top of it all, Boudreaux was sometimes his own worst enemy. He could be very proud, and he would sometimes act tough in front of his camel friends, and on rare breaks, he would even show off how much he could carry. Plenty of camels had actually collapsed doing similar work to Boudreaux and his friends. And after a particularly nasty few weeks when camels were kneeling over left, right, and center, they decided to work together to defend their rights and protect them from these exploitative owners. However, when it came down to it, camels are selfish creatures. They don't trust each other. They were more worried about looking after themselves and working together, so their alliance fizzled out. One Friday, Frank had just finished loading up Boudreaux and his poor exploited fellow camels for yet another grueling and unnecessary trip up and down the mountains. He had piled and piled up goods on Boudreaux's back and was taking a break, chewing on a piece of straw, thinking, smugly about his handiwork. And on a whim, he just decided to toss the straw onto Boudreaux's back, at which point Boudreaux keeled over and suffered a radical, irreversible back collapse. Okay, so what caused Boudreaux to collapse? Right, so you could read this, or maybe a better type of story, to your students and ask this kind of seemingly simple question, but when you start to actually really think about it, was it really just that kind of final straw that was placed on his back, or is the story of what caused it a bit more complicated? And here's a chance where we can kind of help students realize this complexity and organize their own thinking. Right, so we could have them list all the causes they could think of in that story for why he would collapse, but then have them categorize those causes into both the kind of short term, meaning from one instant to a lifetime, from intermediate causes, something between a few years and 100, and then long term, or for being really fancy, the longue durée, 100 years for all of time. Right, and then furthermore, they could kind of annotate these causes. They go with various different symbols to help them keep track of what types of causes these could be, right? And sometimes they could be multiple. And these are just a few examples I quickly came up with. This is how something like this might look, right? So they'd be like, okay, a short-term cause was that final piece of straw, but long-term cause is sort of camel nature, right? They're just fundamentally selfish creatures, right? So this is the kind of thinking that we're asking the students in the 6th, 8th grade band to begin engaging with. Thinking about causes and formulating their claims based on, kind of carefully organizing their thinking about any given topic. Okay, apologies for that. But now I want to talk about the big changes content-wise. Okay, so when you look at the core standards for each grade, you'll see that there are these, we've been calling them kind of framing standards. So after the first few standards in each grade, which generally cover the kind of skills and practices, we have these content standards. And these are these big framing ones. And if you read through these, I think this is like a really quick way to get an idea of like, what are the topics covered in any given course. So of the 3 grades, grade 6 has the fewest framing standards. But this also was done on purpose because we wanted to give the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution itself a very large amount of time within the school year to be covered. Right? And I think if you look at the first page of our course framework for grade 6, hopefully this is kind of apparent here. So I'm going to kind of talk through each of these topics, or most of them, and kind of try and thread how we see this looking here. So again, in grade 5, the last topic in grade 5 is, European exploration, conquest, colonization, and the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not that this is the first time they're learning about European explorers and colonization, right? The focus here is going to be very clearly, though, on English and French colonization. All right. So like they got this kind of broad picture, and yeah, we're imagining a little bit of review at the beginning of grade 6 there, but really they're going to quickly zoom in and look at particularly English and French explorers. Early settlement is going to be, again, kind of similar to what it was in grade 5. We're going to look at and compare Jamestown and Plymouth Rock before looking, broadly at the 13 colonies. We have a whole topic specifically about the, and it's placed here on purpose as well, to talk about, the early connections with colonial governments and the institution of slavery, essentially from the beginning, and just slavery as an institution and how its unique characteristics in North America. Then we will turn and look at French colonial Louisiana. I'll just say too, the topic of slavery hasn't been totally siloed in this institution of slavery topic as well, right? The Code Noir is going to come up in French colonial Louisiana. So anyway, French colonial Louisiana, right? They're going to, not dissimilar to what students learned in 8th grade. They'll also look at the French and Indian War in a way here, right? Because it wouldn't really make much sense to discuss the change to Spanish control. Then we'll look at Spanish colonial Louisiana, Oyola, O'Reilly, the whole king caboodle there. Then we'll look at the French and Indian War from the English perspective and its effect on the colonies, before we go into the rising tensions, road to revolution, the actual course of the American Revolution. And then this whole last window is really set aside to focus on civics, the Constitution. That material is challenging to teach in 7th grade. I taught it in 7th grade for years. No doubt it will be similar in 6th grade, but we have much more time dedicated to it now. So hopefully that helps set up teachers and students for success. But that whole last window is going to be really focused in on civics. And the standards here are much, in my opinion, are much more descriptive of the specific civics we want taught. Okay, grade 7 has a few more framing standards from grade 6. I did want to mention here, if you see 7.8, analyze the influence of key events, ideas, and people on economic, political, and social development. That runs from 1791 to the 1850s. 7th grade, it's a challenge to list out this content, right? They call it the long century for a reason here. There is a lot of content here. In a way, because of the inclusion of some Louisiana stuff, it's almost a little bit more than current 7th grade teachers teach. So this is going to have to move pretty briskly here. So let's talk through the course framework. So like I mentioned before, this grade is going to be most affected that first year as they transition, because students are coming off of world history and being dropped into American history. So we are going to have at least an additional topic that's going to take at least 2 weeks, where we will try and get through the Declaration and the principles of the U.S. Constitution and the basic workings of its structure. So much of the rest of the course won't make sense if that foundation isn't laid down. We totally understand that. We paced out each of these windows to be 9 weeks. We did that purposely so there would be some cushion should things needed to be added, and also just being realistic about how scheduling in a school actually looks. Hurricane days, field trips, et cetera, et cetera. But that's how that's going to start this coming school year. We'll then move to Washington's presidency and the precedents set in there. Looking broadly at what's sometimes called the first party system, the first few presidents. In terms of Louisiana history's inclusion here, I know that the only, people look at this real quick and they see like, okay, the only topic that explicitly says Louisiana is in the growth of a new nation, Louisiana's territorial period and statehood, but that is not the only place where Louisiana's history is going to live, right? Certainly there's going to be a lot in the following topic around the War of 1812. There's going to be stuff in regional development interactions, in reform movements, in growing sectionalism, certainly in the Civil War, secession, Civil War, and Reconstruction. Louisiana history is going to hopefully be very present in our frameworks here. That's certainly our intention and goal. And it's in the standards, right? So any curriculum that ultimately went through our review process and get tier 1 or tier 2, they're going to have that Louisiana history in there as well. Okay, grade 8. So there's so many framing standards here, I almost couldn't fit them on a slide, right? And we do acknowledge that grade 8 is extremely full. There is a lot here. In some ways, again, I think I said this earlier, it's not totally dissimilar to the kind of scope that the old US history standards covered, right? Beginning with westward expansion post-Civil War. Of course, there are many specific differences, though. I do want to say this, though. So this last framing standard here, describe the important key ideas, events, and developments of the modern era. And here you can see it's this last unit, the modern era. In terms of the state assessment, that topic is going to be handled differently. Not totally a new thing, right? The way we handle, for example, the last unit in grade 7 right now, is assessed differently. I can't give a ton of super specific details on this yet, but I can say that it will be handled differently. We are aware that there's not really, in most cases, likely going to be time to teach that topic before the assessment windows arrive. And that topic does, span 20 years, and there's a huge amount of history there. So that's going to have to look different than the rest of the year, and we will give guidance on that. So just again, that last modern era unit will look very different how it appears on the assessment. Okay, to talk through more broadly here, we're starting again post-Civil War westward expansion. We've hopefully, and given the standards, put a little more emphasis onto the experience of American Indians, Native Americans, and how this expansion affected them. Then we will look more deeply at what the end of Reconstruction meant, just the Jim Crow era broadly, but then also particularly in Louisiana, changes to Louisiana's constitutions, etc. Louisiana history is also going to appear when we're talking about populism, reform movements, obviously with Huey Long and the Great Depression, but then very, very clearly, hopefully in both the World War II and the Civil Rights Movement topics here, there's going to be a lot of Louisiana history. Again, I think the challenge for 8th grade is going to be the amount of content that is contained in this grade and moving quick enough to get through everything that ultimately will be accessible. But I think I taught Louisiana history in 8th grade for a while. I think in some ways a lot of teachers have already been teaching some of this because it was necessary to make sense of Louisiana's situation, right? So teaching Louisiana's involvement in World War II, kind of hard unless you give some background about what World War II is about. So hopefully now this actually can be done in a way that is more coherent, and both the teachers and the students, can be assessed on what they kind of had to do before anyways. Okay, so those are the big changes as we see them in both the skills and content in those 3 grades. I want to try to talk more concretely now about some things that we think teachers could begin to do in whatever form their professional learning takes at their school site to prepare for these new standards. But again, we're trying to kind of walk this line between yes, we want to be proactive, but you're still teaching the 2011 standards. You still, if you're, in grade 6 to 8, you're going to have a LEAP assessment that counts on those standards in a few months. So we're just trying to be mindful of that. So these are the 2 things we think people, teachers and people that support them can begin to do. First one is really build content knowledge. There's been big changes in the content that these grades cover. Less so for grade 7, but a lot for grade 8 and completely new for grade 6 teachers. So any time spent building your knowledge of that history is time well spent, right? The dancer becomes the dance kind of thing here. The more familiar and solid you are with that content, I really feel like that's the biggest thing that's going to move student achievement there, is knowing your history. Second thing, building capacity and comfort with teaching using primary sources, right? This is not something new in terms of what the department has been expressing as best practice here, using primary sources in class. And certainly the old scope and sequence made some efforts in this regard, but this is something that takes a while to percolate in. And we have some resources we've created to hopefully help teachers become more comfortable with teaching using primary sources. So we're going to show some of those, but first let's talk content knowledge. So there are a few places we're going to, actually 2 really, direct you to that resources that teachers could use to build their own knowledge. Look, there's no shortage of textbooks, collegiate books, crash course videos, right, on all these topics that you can direct people to and watch. Some of those things contain potentially inappropriate elements, other contentious issues. These are 2 resources we can be relatively sure should be all right. And the other problem with using, if you wanted to, reading Gordon Wood or something like that to build your knowledge of American history, that's wonderful. It doesn't necessarily translate though to how does this look when I'm teaching this material to a 6th grader, right? So that's where we think that the core knowledge teacher guides could be helpful. So some background here. Core Knowledge is a nonprofit based out of Virginia, started by E.D. Hirsch. Excuse me. They've created a history and geography curriculum for grades K through 8 that somewhat aligns to our standards. Certainly, some of the topics appear very similar grade levels. So they have 2 guides for U.S. history. One that covers pre-colonial era to the 1800s, and the other half. And these teacher guides, we think, are actually a pretty good and concise resource that you could point teachers to build their knowledge about any given topic. So you can see here are the two volumes. They're organized by chapters. And so for any given topic in these chapters, they have these guides that go through like defining each of the most important terminology, giving background on the topic. Just again, really concise, excellent definitions, something you could read in an hour or two. And it's not Wikipedia. I mean that in a good way, more engaging and factual than Wikipedia, but it's also not a college textbook. So within this deck are links to both of these volumes that you could use. We didn't give further guidance on like what chapter aligns to what topic. It should be pretty obvious, but if you do have questions, feel free to email us. We're going to give out our contact info at the end here. For Louisiana history, which is now kind of riven through each of these 3 grades, there is no better free resource than Louisiana Endowment of Humanities 64parishes.org. If you go to 64parishes.org/education, you're going to find articles that we have been working with LEH to create over the past 8 or so months. So we have the initial batch of articles are actually finally up there. The rest of them got posted, I think, last week. And so these are directly set up to be used, with students in the classroom. And they cover a lot of the Louisiana topics in the standards, and they will cover all of them. Here's how one of the ones from 7th grade about free people of color looks. It actually tells you the standards it's aligned to at the top, and they're actually organized the same way that our frameworks are. They have like kind of questions that frame each of the paragraphs of text to kind of focus the students on the most important information. We tried to make them as readable as possible, but there's a lot of difficult names and not much you can do about that. Here are the articles that are currently available on that website. Just to be clear too, these are actually going to be in our course frameworks as well, right? So like when we have a supporting question, one of the secondary sources for that question, will likely be one of these articles here. So for grade 6, we got stuff on the Acadians, Bienville, French and Spanish colonial Louisiana, a whole bunch of various tribes. The treaties. I'm not going to read them all. You can see here, but there's not everything is available in this first batch. We tried to kind of prioritize, but here is what you can expect to come out in 2023. This is actually just the first page of 2 here, but it's a lot, right? The standards became very specific, so we're endeavoring to have something for each one of those really specific standards here. Let me just give a second to let everyone read through. And again, a PDF of this deck is available in that folder that we shared. And here's the next set of them. All these will be available early 2023, prior to the summer. All right. So and again, these articles are all being written to be student facing. With organized by questions with various key terminology bolded and giving the definition for. But you could right now use 64 parishes to read essentially about any Louisiana history topic. They likely have an article about it already, written for adults. So if teachers are looking to build their knowledge about Louisiana state history, there really isn't a better resource than that. Okay, and then in terms of becoming more comfortable in understanding how to use primary sources, like we've done for the other grade bands, we created a primary source guide, which is linked here on this page in the slide deck. So I'm going to go over how that kind of looks and what we think it's for. So we're hoping that our source guides kind of answer these three questions here, right? Why are primary sources important to begin with? What are some guidelines for using them with this grade band? And then what are some kind of, here are some example graphic organizers and some kind of verbal cues, things you would ask the students about different types of primary sources to have them develop those skills and practices that are now so present in the standards. So this is kind of what the first page of each guide looks like. This is kind of our why, why we think primary sources make sense for social studies. This is something we're hoping, teachers could read in their cluster or PLC or whatever form professional learning takes their school, and discuss. But the kind of bulk of these things is for each different type of source here. So documents, photographs, objects, maps, political cartoons. We have a kind of protocol, right? So questions that you would either verbally or in writing have students answer that ask them to kind of, first just observe that source, then think critically and evaluate it, and then ask, what other additional questions they might have about it and how they would, go about answering that question. Developing, again, so these kind of thinking like a historian. And then at the bottom, we've given just some real terse ideas for some what are hopefully kind of fun activities related particularly to that type of source. This is the type of thing that will be much more built out in our instructional strategy bank when we're finally done. But this is something to kind of point to some ideas now. And here's an example of what these graphic organizers look like for each of the type of documents. If you came to the previous webinars, right, these look way different than they did in K2 and 3.5 because hopefully the students are capable of a great deal more by 6th grade. Okay. So I'm just going to run through again, kind of hopefully the big things I hit on in the last 45 minutes here. So what supports for the what supports are we offering for 6th through 8th grade teachers? Okay, we are beginning to review curriculum. We had a first submission the other week. I can't really give super concrete deadlines on when those reviews will be complete because there's a lot of variables there. But as soon as we possibly can. But in the meantime, check out our rubric and get an idea about what we would imagine is the ideal curriculum looking like. We are still working on our course frameworks. Again, we're hoping to be complete with all of them in end of March, early April. We do intend to release the first them as we complete them. I wish I could give a date for when the first one will be done. But to be totally honest, this is related to matters of kind of contracts and budgeting and stuff, and it's out of my hands to a degree. So sorry, I can't be more specific about that. Okay, we went through what are the major changes in content and skills, right? For skills, we're really, the big headline changes are what we're expecting students to do with both sources and the kind of quality of claims they can make, especially as it relates to the causes of any given event. And in terms of content, I can't really sum up what I just did really quickly here, but 6th grade is totally different. It's probably the biggest headline change. How can 6th through 8th grade teachers begin to prepare for transition to the new standards? Build content knowledge, build content knowledge, build content knowledge would be my recommendation.